Hello and welcome to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Institute is one of the world's leading centers for interdisciplinary exploration. We bring students, scholars, artists, and practitioners together to pursue curiosity-driven research, expand human understanding, and grapple with questions that demand insights from across disciplines. You can be a part of this vibrant community by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing the special collection held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more, you can visit radcliffe.harvard.edu and sign up to receive more information on news and events. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Phillip B. Williams. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. It is my pleasure to introduce this year's Helen Putnam Fellow, Phillip Williams. A Chicago native, he currently teaches literature at Bennington College. His artistic interests reveal themselves through lyrical and narrative explorations, as well as a revisiting of Afro-diasporic mythologies with contemporary timelines. Professor Williams is the author of the poetry collection Faith in the Interior. In this collection, he investigates themes such as addiction, racism, and homophobia, all too common in our society. During his time at Radcliffe, Professor Williams is working on a dual project, a book of poetry, Mutiny, and a prose called Threshold. Across genre, the projects intersect at an interest in Black spiritual practices, Afro-diasporic mythologies, and alternative ways of authenticating Black selfhood. Mutiny is a collection of poems written through autobiographical and third-person lyrics that aims to record, disrupt, and re-envision narratives of contemporary African-descended people. These poems connect with surrealism and traditional African spiritual practices to probe the real erasure of the factual existence of African descendants in contemporary American archive, especially multimedia news platforms. Threshold is a novel about a conjure woman who has freed enslaved Africans in Arkansas and uses conjure to protect them until her capabilities betray her. The overarching goal of the project is to employ surrealism and myth-making as the aesthetics and creative alternatives used to depict the Pan-African experience in ways that deny Eurocentric claims of African cultural fragility. Professor Williams earned his MFA as a Chancellor's Graduate Fellow from Washington University in St. Louis. He has received the 2017 Whiting Award, the 2017 Kate Tufts Discovery Award, and the 2017 Lambda Literary Award, a 2021 Literary Fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts, and a nomination for an NAACP Image Award. Professor Williams teaches at Bennington College and is a member of the founding faculty for the Randolph College Law Residency MFA program in creative writing. And now it is my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Phillip Williams.
Hello, thank you all for coming today. I'm very appreciative for the Harvard Radcliffe Institution for giving me this opportunity to share my work with you all. I am going between screens, so I'm going to be doing this. I hope that's not too distracting. As Claudia mentioned, my current work converses with African-diasporic spiritualities, folklore, and mythologies in an attempt to reframe the reach and possibility of illusion outside of Eurocentric cultural and historical references that I often relied upon on my own work in previous drafts. So I'm trying to break away from my own bad habits, so to speak. I do not seek to critique or confine others in this exploration, rather to test what is possible within my own creative journey. Before I could begin the journey of figuring out how to use folklore and these mythologies in my work, I had to go back to the origin of these tales in order to find the inspirations of some of the stories that I grew up with, such as the folktale of the Flying African, which would be the predominant story that I'll talk about today. And origin here is how history places these stories' origins geographically. And by geographic, I mean both land itself and the man-made interferences of and upon the land and those above it. So without wanting to, I had to return to the Middle Passage, and my resistance to that was a kind of self-righteous, a fear of falling into an experience of trauma that I've never had. I could never fully grasp, notwithstanding how I had already been trained topiary to and by the very geography I wanted to avoid, which is the slave ship. Perhaps my fear lied in not wanting to dig into the madness of the ship. And in his essay, Mad as a Place, or The Slave Ship Tolls the Ship of Fools, University of Maryland Associate Professor Lamar Jarrell Bruce writes, and I quote, Hortense Spillers further characterizes the Middle Passage as a dehumanizing, ungendering, and defacing project, and I would add deranging to that litany. To derange is to throw off, to cast askew, to disturb the order or arrangement of an entity. Indeed, the Middle Passage literally deranged millions of Africans across continents, oceans, centuries, and life worlds. I use derange also to signal that the Middle Passage and the anti-Black modernities it inaugurated cast the African as categorically mad, wild, perverse, sub-rational, pathological, mentally unsound, end quote. So in conversation with Bruce, I'm going to read my poem called Mushmouth's Maybe Crown. 1. Manacled man, mangled, moreover made menace masked, maybe molded moribund, mostly manipulated, magnanimously marred, mired, mush-mouthed, moored, more. Manacled man, meanly measured, man-monkey mixed with murky mirrors. America's man, minstrel married mophead, magnum man, mama's mine. Might munched, manacled man mimics martyr movements. Moshes minus music, muses, murder made manifestations. My madness, my master. 2. My madness, my master. Many mistake my mood, manhandling my mode. Maybe me making minimalist mumblings means my matriculation. Man-made monster moves merrily, mystifying monogamy. Mainly me mime monsters, malicing municipalities. Me make maintainable moans. Me menu, me metaphor. Me madmen's monitored mission. Merchants masturbate midst my mouth. Me might munch, make men mate monks my molars. My mausoleum multiplies. 3. My mausoleum multiplies immemorial. Me misery, impossible emperor, and maybe me mid moonlight's improvisations. Me immediate, might's emissary. Mayhem maims my museum, me improvise minutes, masticate memory, mortuary mammal, mythic, melisma-minded. Memory makes me meet myself minus meek, mirth, magic. Myself's mess makes me member muzzle, mincing mouth. Maybe murder make my mouth mine. 4. Maybe murder make my mouth mine. Me embellish mercy, mercy, mid-morning. Morning masquerades mercy, imposter. Mercy mouths impelled miracles. Miracles midwife my mind. My mind implies miracles, emancipating me. Impressive. Me embroider impeccable embellishments. Maybe madness make my mouth mine. Me impress embroidered emblems amongst my muscles. Me emaciated emergency, am embargoed myth. My embargoed myth emaciated imagined emergencies, implicated empty embraces. Emotions imitate monsters. Emotions must make music. Me, my monster, and mine, mine, mine. Implosive, me emperor, am imprecise empire. Maybe madness make my mouths minds. Minds here as the Ave possessor for mine, the explosive device, and also a location from which to excavate precious materials. With the help from my research assistant, Mia Word, and Radcliffe colleague, Miriam Powell, I was able to view slave ship manifests of ships that carried enslaved Africans intracontinental, so state to state. Many of the manifests did not have the origin of the journey, merely the destination. But what told me that these were not ship records for journeys across the Atlantic was that the names in the manifest were, well, that they had names in the manifest. They were not anonymous, they were not unknown. I think often of what Professor Saidiya Hartman, Christina Sharp, and M. Nerbezi Phillip have called the ditto of the archive of slavery, which is the absenting of personal identifiers, specifically names, for those enslaved and trapped in the belly of the slave ship. But what the manifest showed me were dittos of gender and color, spanning Black, brown, mulatto, yellow, and even stranger, copper. I decided to name these phenomenon ignorant of this phenomenon, ignorant of if it had already been named. I called this distance anonymity, which was the shrinking proximity between when an enslaved African has their name taken from them and when one is given a new name without their consent. In this case, we can see the power of ditto in the presence of names, for those names are merely the enfleshment of erasure, and over the passage of time, who the enslaved person was before their enslavement is lost in the accumulating ditto of their existence as other than themselves. I would like to show the slide for our final poem for the Black body, and I'll read that poem now. Final poem for the Black body. No names. The list of slaves in the book were simply identified as Negro man or Negro woman at the top of the ledger, and the account book followed by ditto all down the page. M. Nerbezi Phillip. Ditto, 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 I tried to love them out of their caricature, back into a name, to love a name onto them, misbelieving the rendering represented anyone but these featureless tremolos, beckoning in replication a need to be held. They were not children, but their want to be wanted, their being made that way, made a thin nursery of me. How can I say no to them who have contaminated my reflection? I tried to free them, but their ink chains, their two-dimensional silence. I found not bodies, not selves or they. All is ditto, if even one is ditto. A wild grammar taking the shape of what floats. The poem, final poem for the Black body, has as its conflict the act of looking at description of a slave ship, which is an 18th century engraved image dated 1788 of the slave ship Brooks, created by the British and used by European and North American abolitionists in an attempt to end the slave trade. On March 14th, 2019, in a live stream program called Artists in the Archive, the art of the slave ship icon at the Schomburg Center with Dr. Nicole Fleetwood, Professor of American Studies and Art History at Rutgers University, converses with Dr. Cheryl Finley, Associate Professor of Art History at Cornell University, and author of the book Committed to Memory, The Art of the Slave Ship Icon, which is what we're looking at now, the slave ship icon. Dr. Finley states that the original engraving of the pack ship was created in Plymouth, England, 1788, as propaganda in support of the Dolben Act, which sought to regulate the number of enslaved Africans to reduce the suffering and loss of life of not only the enslaved Africans on board, but the sailors piloting the ships. She wants to make clear that this was not a moral act of morality. Dr. Finley coined the term mnemonic aesthetic to describe memory and the practice of making art that has to do with engaging with the past, recovering a memory, or using practices that reinforces a ritualized practice of remembering. How do Black artists, and these are her words, how do Black artists seize upon symbols of the past in times of crisis in order to understand their place in the world, who they are, and how to create work that expresses who they are and where they came from over a period of time, end quote. I had no idea I was doing this myself, having only found the live stream a few days ago and buying the book immediately thereafter. But perhaps Final Poem of the Black Body fits into this aesthetic practice. What I wanted to do was overcome the image as actuality, as a true representation of Black life in the hold. I found myself made uncomfortable by the image because I mistakenly equalized the figures, those markers that are supposed to be bodies. I mistakenly equalized the figures as the very bodies of enslaved Africans. But the image, in all its sorrow, was not vulgar enough. It did not present the extent of the Middle Passage's limbo, over which floated the very nexus of unmaking and remaking. The ritual of replacing each of the non-bodies, the non-selves, here with the ditto, with their psychological truth as dittos, inhabiting not only the hold, but the white imagination, did the work I needed of removing the ease with which I placed myself in the slave ship, freeing the metaphorical African selves and putting the white mind where it belonged, in its own creation. The Flying African is a poem that I'll read next. It's based on the folktale of the Flying African who taught enslaved Africans how to fly back to Africa. The story is often considered a retelling of the historical event of Igbo landing, where Igbo captives were purchased in Savannah, Georgia, and then boarded on a small ship heading to St. Simon's Island. On board, the enslaved Igbos revolted, drowning their captors and grounding the vessel in nearby marshland. It is at this marshland, Dunbar Creek in Glenn County, Georgia, where they chose mass suicide by walking into the water. And one of the versions of the story goes that they were singing, "The water spirit brought us, the water spirit will take us home," a reference to their supreme being, Chukwu. This location is known as Igbo Landing. There are different iterations of the story, and what parts are legend and what parts are factual are not completely agreed upon. This next poem, The Flying African, references Amadioha, who is an Alusi of the storm for the Igbo people. It's not really a spirit. There really isn't an English equivalent for the idea of the term Alusi. But I guess similarly, a spirit might be what we have closest to it. The Flying African. The bird minstrels shrill vulgar mimetics of my folklore song, and whispered incantations, wings scar clean from my back, shake shadows like pools of night over slave quarters, mangled with cotton. Belief in me makes me a belonging, curves me scintillant into half moon like a scythe cradling the sun. A Nancy could never. In Georgia, I heel spun once and took off toward Igbo land, Atlantic water foaming, a hellhound's maw beneath me. Carolinian mansions undressed to ruin as my black feathers curtained Doric columns and draped over old missus a death veil. I wedded Cuba and departed in a hurricane's revolving hunger, Amadioha snatching palm leaves from my swamp-whelmed hair. Unbreakable tale. I shapeshift, my body many-birded, as a serpent winds my throat. Reminder of the soil that waits against the wake of 100 undead ships, carrying me to a living crisis. Need by need, it mattered who needed me. The enslaved unbound by their making me. I contort, beck, and call to resurrect the drowned, bloating the dark sail of a dream. If the truth is that the captured chose the ocean over chains, then I am hope's raw epistle, love lettering alibis against the grave. I carry the stolen many in my mouth, readying for rebellion. Each captured day, I arrive with a new face carved for retribution. My grin, an orphanage of blades. In an interview with interdisciplinary artist Thomas Harris for One World, One Family, Michelle D. Commander, who is an associate director and curator of Lapidus Center for Historical Analysis of Transatlantic Slavery at the Schomburg Center, says of the Flying African myth, it is an origin moment of Afro-Atlantic speculation. There are numerous others. This myth is told differently across the Afro-Atlantic world, but the gist is that in rejection to their captivity, enslaved Africans radically took up flight back across the Atlantic with hopes of returning back to their homelands. In her essay, One of These Mornings, Bright and Fair, Take My Wings and Cleave the Air, The Legend of the Flying Africans and Diasporic Consciousness, scholar Wendy S. Walters explains, an image such as the flying African, the theme of nostalgia and return, become parts of collective memory because of the deep structural similarities existing between and among disparate diasporic cultures. Since such cultures are not monolithically unitary, the legend's context is ever-changing, and so is the legend itself. Thus, central to my comparative methodology is the conception of the legend as process, not product, dynamic, and not static, end quote. After reading this, I decided to work on my own interpretations of the story, revising what it is like to be underwater, what freedoms lie beneath the tide. In my novel in progress, currently between 3 titles, one of which is Threshold, another is Water Knows Your Name, and the last possible title is People of Salt. I imagine a Black town founded during the 1830s by a conjure woman who annihilates plantations and takes the free to Missouri to hide and protect them with her abilities. The following scene is from chapter 4 of the novel, where 2 best friends have different experiences while swimming in the depths of a lake. Later that day, Luther Phillips suggested they go to the lake for a swim. Naked and about a half-mile north of Turney, Luther Phillips tackled Edward as best as he could in the water. Edward had gotten to be as big as any man, solid and tall, his muscles boulders compared to Luther Phillips' lean knots. With his increase in size came an increase in gentleness toward Luther Phillips, greater than he had ever been. When he splashed his friend, he arced the throws too high so that the water split into jewels in the air before landing. He faked like Luther Phillips had strength enough to dunk him beneath the lake and rode with his friend's lunges and swings. The water was cold, so their skin felt each slap with a resonant, near-numb sting. Daylight caused the water to shimmer in their tight hair, lightning bugs at dusk. Sensing his feigned weakness would be discovered, Edward grabbed Luther Phillips by the face with a big pad of his hand and dunked him backward into the water. "I'ma baptize you, boy," he said. Luther Phillips escaped, and his silhouette disappeared into the depths of the lake, breaking through largemouth bass spiraling their spawning beds. He swam more graceful than any fish, quick in the motionless water. He wrapped his legs around Edward's so that neither could kick to stay afloat, and they both went down. A pit of darkness opened at the bottom of the lake where no light could penetrate, as though a sinkhole in the center of the lake sucked in what was left of the shallow parts that edged closer to the shore. The 2 boys sank deeper into the bottom, and the bottom unwrapped beneath them like the inside of an ear. They were entering their own minds, feeling the skin of the other, then feeling it no more until they could not even feel the water. From their building numbness came a strange unity that made one their bodies, but not their minds. Both boys experiencing the sublime the only way they could. Luther Phillips moving his arms in order to swim more quickly into the unseeable. Edward neither struggling to get away from Luther Phillips' clasping legs, nor working to push further into the dark, dropped frozen into the void. Lightless, the bottom drank them in. Space and time halted. Direction became fiction. They were now inside, and to be inside, rewombed and made to reimagine themselves in the darkness that allowed no distraction that visibility of themselves and of the rest of the world would make possible. They became the ultimate possibility. Whatever they were not, they could become in the bottom. Others could not put meaning on them down there, nor could they take meaning away. Their bodies, without the ability of being seen, no longer existed in the way they knew them to. If they could not see their arms, then they could imagine any shape for them. If they could not see their faces, they could draw in their minds the face they most wanted. It was in the room of the mind where all seeing took place. Edward, incapable of understanding this freedom, this vision without sight, began to kick and fight away Luther Phillips' grip, believing the boy was taking him someplace that returning from was unlikely. He reached down and pushed his friend's legs until they slid from him like an oversized belt. When he made it to the surface of the lake, he was shocked by how quickly he made it to the top. The lake was not as deep as it had felt, the bottom not as far from the top as he had imagined. I will close with excerpts from a long poem called Mastery, which culminates the many ideas I have about illusion in Black literature, mythology, spirituality, music, and history. I had lost my notes for the poem in a fire, so I may or may not have all of the allusions that are included in this poem. I wrote down, like, maybe you can make it a game to figure out how many you can pick out from the poem, but of course, you don't have to do that. This poem will take up the remainder of my time, and I thank you in advance for listening. Mastery. The masters are yet dead. Wanting to be human, I tried to rewrite the wasteland. The cannon's reach casts ruinous light. The master's pens breach this page where my own hand spectates. Babylon risen, exorcism in reverse. Whose nature appended now? If I remember my own name, then I can eagle my way through this crowd of shadows that cross the bridge of my back mid-bow. I slept in the fifth house of modernism beneath stars that offered no light. Dust full of fear, my own dead skin encrusting room corners, and my mind in a schism between image and luck. When I awoke, the empire rose in me and I was risen from its dead letters to the letter, chiseled by my own invisibility. This war between smoke and reflection, between self versus self, conniving in the longest hall of my fear to remain there. Many doors scraped open, their alabaster knobs ghost turned while voices as convincing as a mother slipped out. I looked into one room and found a window broken into a smile, wind whistling confederately through the glass. Tell me why I grinned and hollered back a tune. Away, away, I wish the master's dead. To be freed, I tried to revise the wasteland, but blacker, where Margaret Garner speaks to Margaret Walker on a barge across the Mississippi River. I see the aftermath of this, slow in the river mud, fondling the delay. They will make it across. They will pray. They will drown beneath what they know. That the living have undone so many, and the river's dark portion was the color of a baby's dried blood. The neck wound dolorous in its grin-shaped curve, another mangled bridge into history. Who could name the salve between two women death had undone? One woman so sure of whom she'd undone. Garner the master, Garner the slave. The river unfurls its God tongue in Nigger Jim's voice. He speaks of rivers as the river, soul grown deep into a river, carving a country like an infant's throat. There are many ways to freedom, with a hem's lithe blade or a butcher knife. Even now, the blood running through the river runs through my hand, black as a cock that crows for dawn, hilt to hide till mum. Dawn does not know it cannot drown me. Sunrise gilds all water the same dull pageant, and I am water after all. Sun-rinsed, my skin cold hisses, a conquered city, the first flame. Call me Chicago, call me Lake Michigan. I, in a natural mirror or enlightenment, spit back ash rivaling Pompeii. Relent to whom? For what? Night will come again. The stars' epistrophes, their bright punctuations, insult the dark and puncture night again with haunting past tense. Emblazoned with myths and maps of light, imagine cartographies making use of fire and fear, night will come again. A cover, beast blanket, or runaway's winter shawl, a cliche of prose sinks its hatchlings in a man's maw. He rears their small nights to maturity. He speaks in sunsets. This is the end of the world. Even an ended world needs a mythology like snow, like breath, like rust, like feet. Night will come again, and over a sobbing woman who has found her mother's grave for the first time and succumbed to elegy. Her cries bleed over the dirt with a strange insistency. Away, Away, a world drowns beneath this knowledge. Hurston hidden in the garden of heavenly rest, Eden's daughter in the dust, white dresses nest in a magnolia. Their bodiless silhouettes sit, watch as the passing seasons make tombs of burning years pass by. Sweet and fresh, the sudden smell, elegies ride the tailwinds, splayed bodies for a sail. The womb swell of ghosts pushes ships toward a present, filled with flags and saddles, religions and burnt drums. Do not permit them passage, Lord. Imaginations can be so open, and what steps through, what sprints from the past, is just another unjust symptom of drapetomania fondling this fiction's curtains. Do not permit it passage, Lord. A stain uninvited, there's no telling what light will do. Some drunk off the street hollers and passers-by the interpretation of Jubidis, but no one understands. The hex threads of his iris, another river to get lost on. What was said by the ham-bone hustler harping on predictions divined from his palms was that love was not enough, and what I thought was love was only a gateway for the dead. Once I had a lover, not gutless, but as much imprisoned in himself as he was afraid of imprisoning me in his splayed body. He would lie down with me and tell me all the ghosts who rushed to him in the dark. An uncle who died hard, whose eyes were the color of too deep injuries. Pale women who touched and gaped at him. A more demonic form, the size of what could have no size, that choked him while on the other side, his ex-lover slept. I splayed my body's opiated rooms. Rank wind galloped from the cavity, dry as the harmattan. It must be winter in me. Why rush back into invisibility? Father, is that you? My harm? My father must have seen such sights. He was very old when he died, or heard of them, or had this danger touch him. My father was not old when he died, but he looked as the possessed look. His face an apiary, a wasp den, prying like a fact from a story's gap. I shook him in my nightmares, and all the drugs spilled from the wasp-sized holes. Never knowing what drug it was that took him, I made them all his to hold. We counted them, and they were 12. My father, the father who carried the end of civilization, which is the beginning of time, in his nose, his lungs, his mind, in his veins, the wash of second chances. He never shared his demons like new dances with me, but he made new dances, new demons to entertain himself. The king, the king, the king. And danger touched him, sniffed his crown, deemed it unworthy, inedible, and ate the flesh instead. Perchance this myth, a giant struts from the Bible, one man's monster, another man's test. Be humble, says the hero. Little bitch, replies the chorus. And the epic of our lives rests in a radio's top 10 playlist, in the darkness there where no one will ever see, in the stereo's electric heart circuiting a boy's chest. John Henry, let the man breathe. Let the reins of his veins go. Your spooky love won't do, John Henry. Your boogie woogie love won't do. A lover's face carved into a map. And who could leave this violet city? Sorry, I meant violent. I meant to trace the scar on an enslaved woman's forehead caused by a mule's kick. The scar is the gate. I think we'll find our answers there. The how we got here, in the mind of York shaking a deer off his back for his master to devour. Into the mind of a darky specimen tamed by a hug, by a white woman's smile. Into the mind of a polyester suit framed by the black hands and a white mind. John Henry, child, is that you in danger of being touched? Are you Maplethorpe's super nigger, your hammer near hand, cool desire cutting you off from the neck up? I saw you, Mother Mary, floating in a puddle, your porcelain neck broken and letting all the water in. Can't drown that way, cuddled by the waves you birthed. Water your gall and ointment, your rage and your mercy. I told a friend to stop messing with the law, and he heard the Lord. Have mercy. My Chicago Southern tongue don't know A from R, don't know London from Brooklyn. All bridges lead one place. Crossing the water, the dead who have undone so many raise their hands through the surface, raise their heads in cannon. In the wake of disaster, a wake, and water whelmed with attendants and attending histories, anchored to stakes, anchored to chains, clanging panegyrics. another chance. Heaven is where I'll be headed. A deer walks to Lake Michigan and sips from putrid water, then looks up. The tips of its antlers prick the sky like stars lending soft fire to the scene. A hunter lends his arrow to its bow and flexes a shoulder blade, elbow bent to aim into the deer's side, a pierced distance. Air divides from itself to reveal its spectral marrow. Oh, choosy God, choose me. The blue amber sky requiems my solstice. I am the longest day of myself, blissed here in truncated perfection, a hue of indictments I made into keys. Shoot me, hunter. By all things planetary, sweet, I swear the arrowhead's pathway into me will be the doorway, entry into my own self-raised heaven. My head I raise, my babbled tongue a tender memorial. Glossolalia in exorcism, a territorial narrative, this glossary of organs, this shedding of seconds for a pen. I move without editor. You see this, the blinding light reprimanded, revision inconclusive, the cannons wasting the land, and the masters, their remnants, garnered in their human error. Thank you very much. Claudia, it's on you.
Thank you, Philip. This was just amazing. Thank you so much. We do have questions. The first one is from a member of the audience who have decided to teach the Ditto poem in his class next week. And he would like to know which text he should get in order to read the Ditto poem.
So the Ditto poem is in a book called Mutiny that is not coming out until September 2021. So this year, so you'll be able to teach it in the fall. It'll be out with Penguin Press. So maybe there's a way to hold out before trying to teach it. But yeah, that book will be coming out in the fall.
Thank you. Upon completing this project, what would you classify as your biggest takeaways, and how has it been applied to your own personal journey of spirituality?
My own takeaways is that there's flexibility in belief, there's flexibility in spirituality. There is a lot of opportunity to undo. Well, let me think about this for a minute. I'm trying to see what it is I want to say, because I was going to say undo harm, but I need to think of the source of the harm, right? It could be institutional, coloniality, the history, the harm of the misinformation in the archive or things that are hidden by the archive. Just doing this project allowed me to understand that there are mysteries that sometimes feel, or in actuality are, more important or more closer to real than anything that I've been taught is my actual reality. For instance, the story of the flying African being a myth, right, could also be symbolic of the very ways that I could break from the chains of this artistic stupor I was in, where I kept referencing and going back to the things that I was taught in school, which is Shakespeare, T.S. Eliot, and Wordsworth, oh goodness, a plethora of others. I'm thinking Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And there's nothing wrong with those being part of my library of knowledge. However, there are many sources of artistic endeavors, sources of creativity, sources of spiritual freedom that I can dig into that are more related to me and that resonate more with me and my experiences and my ancestors' experiences. Also, in doing these two projects, I created an altar for my ancestors, and I hadn't done that before, and I always wanted to. I found courage in doing that by doing some of this research and really delving into the meat of the novel, where a lot of these characters wish they knew who their family members were, as immediate as a mother or father. And so I felt more compelled to dive into what I was once afraid of, which are these methods of remembrance.
Right. We have a question from one of the Radcliffe research partners. And this person said, everything sounds so amazing. What inspired you to start this project?
Oh, thank you. Anger. Anger inspired this project. And I mean that quite simply. I was very angry when I started Mutiny in particular, which is the book of poetry. The novel I started in 2006. I was an undergrad, and it was originally a short story. That was not part of the anger. That was part of me wanting to read a story that had magic and it wasn't shied away from, because in many ways I think writers were taught that if you had magic in the stories then it was no longer literary, and I wanted to test the realms of that even as like a what was that 18, 19-year old. And so from there to now the story has of course expanded and I had to mature to get it to where it is now. um, so that's I guess to loop back around, the first inspiration was me wanting to include magic and it not be magical realism or something like that. It's just that magic is included in what is the real texture of these characters' lives, and it's not fantasy. It's just, it is what it is. And then for poetry, it was me being very angry with just the state of where I was in my relationship to poetry and poetics, to the idea of community, to my own obsession with the same things without being capable of writing them in different ways. So Mutiny is a title that both points to historical mutinies and also a revolt against my preoccupation with what it means for me to be a poet and what the expectations that were placed on me, as far as what I should do as a poet. I just shrugged it off. And so those were the the main inspirations for these two projects.
The next question, aside from allusion, are there other literary craft elements that you are particularly interested in troubling in these manuscripts? For example, how are you considering metaphor, and in this work in relationship to the unutterable, unexplainable, silenced, and missing?
Oh, that's a fantastic question and not an easy one. My focus on the word allusion, I hope also will include metaphor, in as much as what I allude to is oftentimes alluded to be metaphor for something else. So for instance, when thinking about the illusion of, where is it? In the poem I just finished reading, Mastery, there's a line that reads, or actually I probably should go to the notes section, but there are lines in there that are alluding to a work, but are metaphorical for something outside of the very thing that they're alluding to. And it happens a lot. So it's more of a layering of these literary devices so that I can have the illusion be outside of the Eurocentric canon, but then in that illusion, I think it might be an allusion to Beloved with the dolorous neck, the infant's neck being cut, and also the river of blood, and using Langston Hughes as a Negro speaks of rivers, right? So alluding to that, but that being a metaphor for the blood that runs through my veins, right? So there's all of these layerings of the literary devices so that they never really act independent of each other. They're always forming a network so that the work itself has, for those who can pick up on it, and this might be frustrating for some readers, but for those who can pick up on it, they have this different levels of possibility for understanding, with the hopes that not knowing some of these references, you can still enjoy the poems for what's on the surface, and also sonically what they're doing with sound.
Right. A follow-up to the question, so do you find long-term poetry particularly helpful for the themes that you're currently investigating?
Long-form poetry?
Yes.
Yes. The poem Mastery got that long because I couldn't stop myself. And I didn't want to stop myself. Part of, again, the title Mutiny being, what are the restraints that are placed on me or that I place on myself as a poet? And there's a lot of frustration around the long poem. And one can argue it's about attention spans and, how damaged are we because of the internet? I don't want to go that deep into it, but for whatever reason, the long poem isn't one that, at that time I had been writing it, was really being investigated. But now you're seeing more and more long poems come from my contemporaries, meaning poets who are just getting started or still early in their careers. And I needed this space to, for lack of a better word, pop off, to just say what I need to say how I need to say it, and also to move against linearity, to just have things sit side by side, so that just by being juxtaposed or paralleled or whatever, however you want to describe it, they created a new meaning, or they questioned meaning, or they subverted understanding. I could do that with a short poem, but the long poem allowed me more access and more opportunities to do that.
Right. Another question about the ditto poem. How did you write the ditto poem? Did you add a score for the rhythm, which appears to be essential to the performance?
The ditto poem is a team effort with poet Keith Wilson. Keith emptied out the ship. I couldn't do it myself, and I filled in the ship. And Keith Wilson is a fantastic poet, and the way that he does visual poetics is out of this world. And I kept trying to figure out, how can I get these, I don't know what to call them still. I don't like calling them bodies. I call them figures. How can I get these figures out of this ship? And everything that I tried ended up leaving a weird residue, like these white square coffins, right? And that was, it was a completely different experience in doing that. And so I asked him if he could clear out the ship of the figures, and then I made sure that there was a ditto for each figure that was removed. So that's the process of making that. So it was very tedious. And because I don't have knowledge for Photoshop, I had to do all of this in Word. That is my curse, which is also the reason why I couldn't remove the figures on my own. There is no score. I freestyled that. I just decided to do that today. I briefly practiced it before I got online. And it seemed appropriate in as much as I had to constantly take a breath, right? Taking a breath that, if I'm imagining, what is it like to be in the hold of a ship? How does one breathe down there? What is the breath? What is breath underwater? All of these questions came to mind as I kept repeating the word ditto, which is a namelessness. It's a removal of the name, right? And so there were just a bunch of different things that came to me as I was doing it. And I knew that the only way I could get across the importance of having all of these dittos and repetition was to read, because I'm not actually reading them. I'm just going through the motion, letting my body tell me when to stop, was to read as many of them as possible.
Thank you for that. The next question. That was an incredible reading. Can't wait to read Mutiny when it comes out. What is the aesthetic recovery of the past practice you mentioned before talking about the flying African myth?
Yeah, so that is mnemonic aesthetics. So the book that I mentioned is called Committed to Memory. Let me give you the full title. It has a subtitle. So Committed to Memory, The Art of the Slave Ship Icon. And it's by Dr. Cheryl Finley. And she talks about this term that she coined, is mnemonic aesthetic. Mnemonic, M-E-M-O-N-I-C aesthetic. I'm spelling because I don't know if I'm saying it in a way that's understandable. Mnemonic aesthetic. And it just describes memory and the practice of making art that is considering a recovery of the past, a recovery of memory. But then also in the book and in the lecture, she talks about the ways that appropriation is important to this process too, and repetition. And so when creating the ditto poem, I actually had a collection of these empty ships to figure out how I wanted to do it. I did not know I was participating in this because I did not know this was a real thing. And so discovering this post was so frightening and inspiring. And I need to talk to Dr. Finley one day. It's like, yo, thank you for, writing this book and giving language to this process, this ceremony that I was putting myself into by repeating over and over again not just the word ditto, but even just considerations of how to do the project.
Right. The next question, poet Gregory Orr has written a book called Poetry as Survival, in which he discussed writing poems as a way to transform trauma into art. Does that approach speak to your art?
I don't know if the answer is yes or no. I am having challenges around the word trauma. And I don't think there's anything wrong with what Gregory Orr is talking about. I'm not challenging that. I am challenging myself as far as how am I relating to the word trauma and how am I putting it inside of the work. I describe my work more so as investigations of the grotesque as opposed to trauma. I am interested in finding beauty in the language of describing things that are considered grotesque, particularly the dead. I do not shy away from writing about, corpses, dead animals, rituals of the dead, things like that. So when trauma or events or situations, historical moments that are considered to be traumatic are involved, what I am thinking first and foremost is where is the what are the moral questions of there possibly being beauty in this, right? In a way where when I read a book like Thereafter Johnny by Carol Olivia Heron, which has sexual abuse in it, incest, but it's a gorgeously written book, right? And so I have to pull myself away from the idea of something being untouchable because it's a hard topic, because I'm an artist first. And in many ways, I don't feel as though, and this doesn't mean it's not true, right? I'm not saying that it's not true that I might be doing this, but my first inclination is not to render the traumatic or to investigate the traumatic, though I do know that the topics I touch on deal heavily with trauma. I am looking for how to make it so that when we view it, we're viewing different sides of it. We're viewing different potentialities of it, different possible lives of the event, of the grotesque, of the ugly. And maybe that makes it easier to look at, or maybe that complicates the ugliness, right? I don't know if that answers your question. If anything, it gives me another question that I have to ask myself, which is, how does the word trauma move through me as I think about creating art? And so I'll be doing that.
Right. The next question says, I know that you are also drafting a novel. Will these same thematic concerns continue in your fictional work, or are you traversing other emotional landscapes?
In this current novel, yes. In other novel ideas, there'll be different landscapes. I don't know if I'm writing connected work or not. I don't want to promise to myself, oh yeah, this is a trilogy or whatever, because that's, who knows what it is. But I do already, in thinking about other books that I have in mind, see the connections thematically, but they're going to operate differently. So this current novel does take place in predominantly the 1800s. And the next novel idea that I have is absolutely contemporary, meaning that it takes place within whatever this moment or close to this moment is. And just by switching centuries, there could still be thematic concerns, but the way that those concerns are investigated have to be different because the times are different. And I also want to shift away from the legacy of slavery and figure out how this magical world, how this system of spirituality can be infused in daily life. And thinking about my own family, there's a story. We have a little time for the story. There's a story that my mom told me about my grandfather, which is how I began writing Threshold. His sister was not home. This is in Gary, Indiana. He lived with his sister, my grandfather. And a friend of hers came to the door. Before she got there, my grandfather had a habit of salting his thresholds. And that means he would put salt on window sills, door frames, at the thresholds of the doors. He did that to bless the house, to keep negative energy out of the house. And so his sister's friend came, knocked on the door. He opens the door. She's like, hey, is T in? He's like, no, but you can come in and wait for her. He told my mother that the woman made a move as though she was going to cross the threshold. And then she suddenly stopped and she paused. She said, no, I think I'll wait for her outside. And he invited her in again, like, no, it's hot out. You can have some water, whatever. She's like, no, just till I came back. And she refused to come. She refused to come in after and she had come in before. And so that's the kind of stuff that I want to work with, where this is not, it's not something to shrug off. It's part of the everyday lives, right? So that's where I want to go. But I want to do that within the moment of a kind of today.
That's great. I guess we have time for one last question, hopefully more, but let's see. So listening to you read your poems was so powerful. What's gained and what's lost when readers read a poem for themselves?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for the compliment as well. What is gained is you get to interpret the poem in your own voice, in your own mind. What is gained is you gain yourself. The poem introduces you to a different version of yourself, different ideas that you might have had locked in you. What is lost is, of course, my voice, my interpretation, my intentions, but that's not really all the time important. You can get that from interviews that, or me doing this now, you're getting what it is that I mean and how I mean. But what you gain from the text and my absence is, to me, as important, if not more important, than me being there to say, oh, well, you missed this. Did you pick up on that?
Okay, we do have time for one more question. So this reading took my breath away. I was wondering if you could speak to the sonics of your mashmouth poems, their utterance, and how they make meaning through accumulation. And what does the act of alliteration mean to you?
The act of alliteration for me is one of obsession. It's the repeated sound, percussion. I was really going for a kind of drumming sound, but I did not want it to be on a hard consonant. I chose the letter M because of the humming, the softness of it. Also wanting to use the idea of madness and what does it mean when language is limited, right? When you have some restraints on language, and not just as a poet, as an aesthetic practice, but as a person living in a world where we do not always have an audience, when we need one, when we're harmed, when we're in trouble, when we are seeking justice, right? And putting the limitation on myself with just using one consonant sound, because it's not just the letter M, but also the sound of M, as in the word emperor, right? That starts with the letter E, but it has the M sound. I wanted to participate in the very constraint, the very lack that the speaker of the poem seemed to be experiencing as they're breaking from that, as they're attempting very, I think, successfully to be free and to say, regardless of what it is that you, or regardless of the ways by which you've limited me, I still am going to explode from this prison of language, this entrapment of silencing.
Wow. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.
For the amazing presentation and for your perspectives. I also want to thank you, the audience, for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.